Greg Clark here with the CPX podcast, and my guest today is Bill McKibben. Bill is one of the brains behind 350.org, the organisation that was set up to deal with climate change. He's been a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of some 10 books, including what I think is the first book on global warming, published in 1989 and called The End of Nature. And his recent book is called Deep Economy, and he's in Sydney to give the Sydney University Ideas Lecture tonight. Bill, thanks for being here. Welcome to CPX.
It's my great pleasure to be with you.
Am I right? Is it the first book on global warming in 1989?
Yeah, the first book for a non-scientific audience. The chemists and physicists had been talking about it for a few years, but I took it upon myself to translate some of it for the lay audience, as it were.
And it's in 20 languages and around the world now, I hear.
Yes, yeah, and unfortunately, though I've spent 20 years hoping and praying that it would turn out to be wrong, time is vindicated. Not only vindicated, we now understand that global warming is happening more quickly and on a larger scale than we had expected.
Well, you've come into Sydney at an interesting time where the Australian government has just rejected certain or backed down from its carbon emissions trading scheme that had set up, delaying it by a year, and some people are very unhappy with the targets. What do you make of all that?
The same thing is happening really many places around the world, and it means one thing, that we haven't built a strong enough movement to demand change. Vested interest, the power of the fossil fuel industry, and the inertia of systems are all very strong. They don't bend easily. One can rest assured that every member of your parliament hears regularly from the coal industry, from the cement industry, from all the industries that want to keep pouring carbon into the atmosphere for free. They don't hear enough yet from the other side. Australia's done a better job than some places. You helped fight an election over climate change. But still, it's not a big enough or strong enough movement. Now that, I think, will be changing. That's why we're doing 350.org. That's why some of your groups like Get Up are doing a really stellar job of trying to mobilize people. But it's a now or never proposition. We don't have endless amount of time to deal with climate change. If we don't deal with it soon, we're not going to deal with it.
Well, but how realistic is it to expect people to deal with it now, with a global recession on? And I mean, can we really expect people to get behind climate change?
Well, I think we have no choice. Chemistry and physics are driving the show here. And they're, they don't care that there's a recession on. They will go at their own pace, and the pace they're going at is fast, as evidenced by the, bushfires across Australia, as evidenced by the fact that your rivers are drying up, as evidenced by the fact that the Arctic is melting, as evidenced by 1,000 other things around the world. That's part of it. We can't wait for those reasons, but we shouldn't wait anyway. The clearest, surest way out of the economic trouble that we've fallen into is to engineer the real new economy that's coming, the clean energy economy with green jobs that are close to home. No one's going to send their house to China to have it insulated. That's work that'll have to be done in Australia by Australians, and should be, and sooner rather than later.
Well, the government will give us money for that at the moment. So.
There you are.
Now, this number, 350, you've talked about it as the most important number in the world. What does that mean?
Most important, and we didn't even know it existed 18 months ago. When the Arctic melted in the summer of 2007, our best climatologists, led by the American scientist James Hansen at NASA, went back to work and published a paper for the first time telling us where the red lines were. For long history, until the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was 275 parts per million, give or take 10 parts per million. So, depending on your background, call that the Eden number, the Buddha number, the Shakespeare number. That's what we know works. That's what human civilization was built in, okay? Industrial Revolution comes, we burn coal, gas, and oil, pour carbon into the atmosphere, that number begins to mount. We always hope that the danger line is a few decades down the road. That's human nature. We hoped that this would be our children's problem to deal with. That's not a very nice thing to have hoped, but that's what we hoped. When the Arctic melted, it became clear that that was no longer the case. The number that Hansen and his team gave us was 350 parts per million CO2. Any amount greater than that in the atmosphere, they said, was not compatible with the planet upon which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. Pretty strong language for a peer-reviewed scientific paper. Especially strong language when you know that we're already above it. We're at 387 parts per million now, and rising about 2 per year. That's why the Arctic is melting. That's why Australia is catching on fire.
Okay, but I still hear some fairly skeptical voices out there, and we have people publishing, like Ian Plimer in Australia, publishing, saying that you can't read the data so easily, that, this climate change isn't really occurring. Is it really hard to read the data?
No, it's not. And the world's climatologists are in firm agreement. I mean, there's a strong consensus and has been for a dozen years, and one warm year after another just makes it all the clearer. For a time, you had to believe the scientists, you had to study what they... Now all you have to believe is your own eyes. There's no other reason that all of a sudden we have huge loss of summer ice in the Arctic. There's no other reason that all of a sudden dengue fever, the mosquito-borne disease, is spread. Its incidence is up 100, 200, 300% this decade across South America and Asia as that mosquito that spreads it expands its range in a warmer and wetter world. I believe into parts of Australia now, too. There's, no other reason that we've seen massive disruptions in hydrological cycles such that we have vast increases in drought, in arid places. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. Once that water's up in the sky, it's going to come down. So we've had vast increases in deluge. Don't believe the scientists. Go ask the insurance companies. Look for the record of their payouts over the last decade, which make it abundantly clear what's going on.
So you have no time for that argument. These are just normal fluctuations you see over time.
That was the original question 20 years ago, when this hypothesis was first out there. Can we find an anthropogenic, a man-made signal amid the noise of climate? Because climate's a noisy system. That was solved by about 1995. It's abundantly clear. It's not scientists who are calling this into question. It's ideologues who don't want to deal with the implications, which are that we're going to have to put a price on carbon. We're going to have to finally accept that it's unwise to pour it for free into the atmosphere and change the climate. It's unwise in every way, economically and socially, and certainly not only unwise, but unfair in some deep fashion.
Okay, so you talk about global warming being the big story of our time.
Absolutely.
Is it bigger than world poverty? Is it bigger than AIDS? Why should it get all the focus?
It's not only, in a sense, bigger than world poverty because its implications are for geological time, It's also quickly emerging as the biggest cause and contributor to world poverty. I was in Bangladesh not long ago when they were having their first big outbreak of dengue fever. Bangladesh, quite beautiful country, but a country that's going to be completely screwed by climate change. The Bay of Bengal is quickly rising, like all oceans, and hence salt water is intruding on people's farm fields and things. We think that there are hundreds of thousands of climate refugees arriving from the countryside in Dhaka each year. Meanwhile, the great glaciers in the Himalayas that provide the source for the sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra that flow out across Bangladesh, those glaciers are melting quickly and won't be there much longer. When I was there, though, the big acute problem was this dengue fever. They're having their first big outbreak. I was in the slums a lot, so I got bit by the wrong mosquito, and I came down with it. I remember going to the clinic. I mean, it's the sickest I've ever been. It's called breakbone fever, they call it. I didn't die.
Horrible.
Yeah, no, I didn't die, obviously. Lots of people did. Old people, young people, people who weren't well-nourished going in. I went down to the big hospital in the center of Dhaka, this huge ward, cots stretching as far as you could see, and people shivering on them, and in between, because there weren't enough cots, people lying on the floor and shivering. And my main thought looking out at that was, you know what? These people have done nothing to deserve this. when the UN tries to measure how much carbon each country emits so that we might do something about it someday, you can't even get a number for Bangladesh. It's a rounding error in the calculations. There's 140 million people, 7 times the population of Australia. But they're mostly not connected to the electric grid. The basic means of transportation is the bicycle rickshaw, This is not their fault in any way.
Well, another argument, though, that's brought up a lot is that these countries like India and China are finally drawing their populations out of poverty thanks to industry, thanks to expansion and so forth, largely through burning coal. But can we ask them to give it up?
We can't ask them point blank to give it up because they're smart. They realize that the West spent 200 years burning coal in order to become prosperous. On the other hand, because they're smart, they realize that their future is imperiled deeply by climate change. The Yangtze and the Yellow find their source in those same glaciers in the Himalayas. The Pearl River Delta is, very low to the ocean. We're already seeing big drought across the North China Plains. They're willing to make a deal, but it's going to have to be a deal. The West is going to have to transfer some wealth, mostly in the form of technology, from us to China and India and the rest of the developing world to make up for the fact that they won't be able to use the easiest of their resources to get to, that cheap coal. If we want them to put up windmills, we're going to have to pay some fraction of the cost of the difference between that and burning that cheap coal. It'll be like the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, when the U.S. sent lots of aid to the countries it had just defeated, and there was some mix of idealism and shrewd pragmatism in that plan, and we need that same kind of mix now.
Okay, now, some people say that Christianity actually has played a terrible role in causing climate change, back to the kind of arguments of White and 80s and so forth, that Christianity has been linked somehow to the development of capitalism and industry and these sorts of things, individualism. Are you of that view?
It's a very complicated question because, of course, there is something in the notion. The Bible is one of those books that people are more likely to read the first page of than the whole thing, in my experience. And hence it's damaging that on the first page we find this admonition to, that we're to have dominion over the world. And people have interpreted that, I think, too often to mean we can do what the hell we want with what's around. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that it's not Christianity alone. We can look at cultures where Christianity is not an important part of it, Eastern cultures and things, and see, at least in some cases, the same kind of disregard for the environment. More to the point, we now understand that we can find in Scripture, among many other places, the resources we need in order to start dealing with this. Think about that passage about dominion, okay? In the Hebrew, it's a word that's used throughout the Old Testament. It's all about taking care of. It's the same word that kings are supposed to have dominion over their subjects.
It's not domination, it's care. Yeah.
Well, it's as if you said, I'm going out for the evening, I've called a babysitter, and I'm leaving them in charge of my children. You don't expect to come home and find your children with tattoos, that's not the deal.
Maybe my children.
That's what we've done, We've wrecked the planet that we were given dominion over. Think about Noah, the first radical green that we know of, saving a breeding pair of everything, And now we're busy. The best estimate is that we may lose 50% of species on this earth this century because of our own carelessness and recklessness. That's why it's good that finally we're seeing some kind of development of a religious environmental movement around this world, in Christianity and in a number of other faiths.
Well, let's move to that a little bit. You're not backwards about your own Christian commitment. How does it fit together with your love of the environment? Where did that love of the environment come from, and is it connected to your Christian faith?
Yeah, at some level. I mean, I love the natural world and feel extremely at home there, and there are plenty of Sunday mornings when I'm out hiking and not in church, partly because it often feels like a better church.
I've been told you can ski out of
I
your
can
back
ski
door.
out my
down the
back
hills.
door, yes. I'm a cross-country skier and a great lover of it. For me, as a Methodist, it's been very important to encounter the Bible in many of its aspects. I wrote a little book years ago. I'm not a theologian by any means. I'm, the most I've ever been is a Sunday school teacher. And in our little church, you don't have to be much to be a Sunday school teacher. If on Christmas Eve you can take a tea towel and turn a fourth grader into a Palestinian shepherd for the pageant, that's plenty of qualification. That's what we can do, But I did write a little book years ago about my favorite book in the Bible, the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, which is really, one of the first modern pieces of literature. And the end of it, God speaking from a whirlwind, is the longest soliloquy that God delivers any place in the Bible, Old Testament or New. It's also the first great piece of nature writing in the Western tradition. Very crunchy, biologically accurate, sexy, incredibly beautiful, well worth reading. I'd recommend if you can get your hands on it, a magnificent translation by Stephen Mitchell that North Point Press published some years ago. At any rate, the argument in Job goes like this. Job finds himself cursed and living on a dung heap at the edge of town, and his family has died and all his flocks have died. And far from being patient, he's angry and demands that God come and he spends like 35 chapters demanding that God come and explain why this thing has happened to him. And finally, God does come and delivers this long talk, but it's really a kind of sarcastic taunt that God delivers. And it doesn't have anything to do with these questions of justice and things that Job want answered. It's basically this tour of the physical universe and how beautiful it is. And God keeps saying, if you're so smart, can you tell me where I keep the waves? Can you whistle up a storm? Do you know where the snow is stored? But on and on. After quite a bit of this, Job finally just says pretty much, sorry I asked, and sits down. Which is always how we've always been sort of small and part of something big and beautiful and orderly and significant, In our lifetimes, in the last 30 years, we've suddenly grown very large. And now we can answer God right back and just spit in his face. God, do you know, can you tell the proud waves where to break, say here and no more? Job, no, but we...
The scientists say yes, we know what to say.
That's us now, Oceans are us. Storms, we see things like Hurricane Katrina. In the insurance policy, they're still listed as acts of God, but that's kind of blasphemous at this point. At least in part, they're acts of us and our own carelessness. So that's half for me. And the other half is to read the New Testament, and which is, for all the insane elaboration and whatever that we give it, an incredibly simple book. Jesus says over and over and over again, when the dim-witted disciples keep losing track of what the whole thing is about, every time he has to say, love God and love your neighbor. Love your neighbor, love your neighbor, love your neighbor. That's the whole damn thing, If we're giving our neighbors dengue fever, drowning them, cutting off their water supply, all the things that we're doing in the West by pouring carbon into the atmosphere, then our claim to be able to say we're loving our neighbor in any significant way is small.
I read your very influential article in Harper's about the Christian church in America and how you felt it was failing to behave in a Christian way. Is this what you're talking about, the failure to love your neighbor?
Absolutely. I mean, the Christian church in the United States became identified in the last 20 years, too much of it, not the Methodist Church but much of evangelical Christianity allowed itself to become deeply identified with right-wing Republican unpleasantness and, this visceral opposition to taxes, for instance, didn't seem to bother anyone that that meant that poor people didn't have, ways to get food or housing or whatever else. That kind of stuff,
is it the culture of individualism that you think you're attacking there?
I think it certainly is, and that's the American gloss on a lot of things, the hyper-individualism that we live under, and it's not at all, the very first people who heard the Christian message knew instinctively that what they were to do was go and form communities, and that's what they did. That's why all those letters of Paul aren't to particular people, they're to communities. They're to, the church at Thessalonica or Galatia or wherever it is, The good news is that that's changing. I've been able to watch in the last few years as the church across the board has now begun to come to grips with some of that and begun to take an active role in the environmental movement. We're running this big 350.org campaign that will peak on October 24th when there'll be thousands of actions around the world. We'll have climbers high up in the Himalayas and 350 scuba divers on the Great Barrier Reef and, people on Easter Island and rallies in big cities. But we're going to have lots and lots and lots of churches involved. We're going to have thousands of churches, we think, that'll be ringing their bells 350 times on that Saturday as a kind of act of witness, at least where I come from, in rural areas, when things, before we had, cell phones and all of that, if something in town was on fire, well, you rang the church bell so everybody would know and come help put it out. Well, something is on fire, and it's perfectly appropriate. Indeed, almost mandatory to ring that bell and add the voice of the church to that. And not just, Christian congregations. We've had wonderful participation from faith communities across the board. We got an email the other day with a photo from a Buddhist kingdom, Ladakh, high in the Himalayas. And they'd heard about this because the Dalai Lama had endorsed this 350 campaign. And they'd had a day-long conference sort of about it. And at the end of the day, as the sun was setting on the beautiful mountains behind them, they took a picture of these 1,500 monks and nuns in a sort of human 350 up against the mountains. Very, very moving. Especially moving when you realize that people in Ladakh haven't done a darn thing to cause climate change, but they're willing to step up and be part of the solution to it, help change the conversation, which is what we're trying to do at 350.org.
One more theological question. On the Christian side, at least, some people worry that the emphasis on creation, care, and I guess the horizontal aspects of Jesus' teaching can compromise or jeopardize the vertical, the salvation, the forgiveness of sins, the repentance. What's your response to that kind of criticism?
I'm not a great theologian. I know what we were told to do over and over again. We were told to love our neighbors. And I think one can trust that the rest will take care of itself, if we manage to do that. In our world at this time, that's the outward sign, I think, of what it means to be a Christian.
One last question for you then. As you're traveling around America and actually around the world, what kind of feeling do you get about the spirit and the will that's there to do something about global warming? Are you optimistic?
Optimistic.
The long sigh suggests that you're not.
The name of the book that I wrote about this stuff 20 years ago was The End of Nature. Okay, so I'm not really a glib Pollyanna, in these things. On the other hand, it's incredibly good to see the resurgence of activism by young people in particular around the world. And these are our greatest allies in the United States, here in Australia, where we've been spending wonderful time with the Australia Youth Climate Coalition, in New Zealand, where we just came from, the same thing, in India, where we have huge networks through the universities, in China, where thousands of kids with a huge 350 placard just sent out on a march across the countryside. That stuff's really encouraging and really optimistic and really beautiful. And it's really beautiful when you see it in places where you don't expect it. I was not long ago at Oklahoma Christian University in Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma is the most conservative state in the United States, I'd imagine. And Oklahoma Christian is probably the most conservative corner of the... But you know what? After I'd given my talk, the kids more or less took over the chapel and rang the bell 350 times the next day, and have been devoted parts of this campaign ever since. They're catching on. Humans have a bad tendency to wait until the last possible minute to do what we need to do. We often seem to exhaust all the other possibilities before we figure out that it's time to do the right thing. Global warming is the final test of that, because the time in which we have to act is very short. And when I'm pessimistic, it's because I think we won't rise to the occasion quickly enough. But it'll be interesting. I mean, this is the final test of whether the big brain that God gave us was a good idea or not. Whether it was evolutionarily adaptive or maladaptive. And we're going to find out, and we'll find out in our lifetimes. And hence it seems to me more than worthwhile to spend what time and energy I have trying to make the story come out at least a little better.
Bill McKibben, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.